Benjamin Franklin begins his intellectual journey in a world where science, politics, craftsmanship, and philosophy were still deeply intertwined. He would eventually become famous as a statesman, diplomat, inventor, publisher, and one of the most recognizable figures of the American Revolution. But beneath all these identities was a mind driven by one central desire: to understand how the world worked and to find practical ways of improving human life. Franklin was born in Boston in 1706 into a large family in colonial America. His father, Josiah Franklin, was a soap and candle maker, and the household was crowded with children. Benjamin received only a limited formal education. His schooling ended when he was still young, not because his curiosity had ended, but because his family could not afford to keep him in school. This limitation would become one of the defining circumstances of his life. Without a university education, Franklin became largely self-educated. He read constantly, taught himself through books, experimented with ideas, observed people, and developed an extraordinary appetite for knowledge. He did not see education as something that ended when a teacher left the classroom. For him, learning could happen anywhere. A printing shop could become a school. A conversation could become a lesson. An experiment could become a philosophical investigation. A mistake could become useful knowledge. At the age of 12, Franklin was apprenticed to his older brother James, who worked as a printer. The printing trade would profoundly influence his future. Printing gave Franklin access to something more valuable than money. It gave him access to information. He learned how books and newspapers were produced, how arguments were constructed, how political ideas spread, and how written words could influence thousands of people who had never met one another. The young Franklin became fascinated with writing. Because he wanted to improve his own abilities, he secretly submitted essays to his brother's newspaper under the name Silence Dogood. The essays were written from the perspective of a fictional middle-aged woman and offered witty observations about society, education, religion, and everyday life. The pieces became popular. Even Franklin's brother did not initially know who was writing them. This early experiment revealed something important about Franklin's personality. He understood that knowledge could be communicated effectively when it was combined with humor, clarity, and an understanding of ordinary people. But his relationship with his brother eventually became strained. Benjamin wanted greater independence. At 17, he left Boston and traveled to Philadelphia, arriving with very little money and few possessions. The young printer entered a city that was rapidly becoming one of the most important centers of colonial America. Philadelphia would become his home. Franklin began working in printing and quickly developed a reputation for intelligence and reliability. He eventually established his own printing business and, in 1729, became involved with the Pennsylvania Gazette. The newspaper became highly successful. Franklin used it not merely to report events, but to discuss politics, morality, science, education, and social improvement. His writing was direct and accessible, and he understood that printed information could shape public opinion. But his ambitions extended beyond journalism. He wanted to create a culture in which ordinary people could educate themselves and contribute to the improvement of society. This philosophy eventually led to one of his most important civic achievements. Franklin helped establish the Library Company of Philadelphia, an organization built around the idea that books should be available to people who could not afford large private libraries. The principle was simple. Instead of every individual buying every book, members could contribute collectively and share access to knowledge. It was an early expression of Franklin's belief that education should serve the public. He became increasingly interested in organizing communities around useful purposes. Fire was a constant danger in colonial cities. Buildings were often constructed closely together, and firefighting systems were primitive. Franklin helped establish the Union Fire Company, one of the earliest organized volunteer firefighting companies in Philadelphia. He also supported improvements in public safety, street lighting, paving, and other civic systems. Franklin was developing a philosophy of practical citizenship. He believed that society could be improved through cooperation, organization, and useful knowledge. This same attitude shaped his approach to science. Franklin did not view scientific investigation as something reserved for isolated academics. He believed ordinary people could observe nature, conduct experiments, and contribute to knowledge. During the 1740s, his attention increasingly turned toward electricity. Electricity was still poorly understood. Scientists had observed static electrical effects for centuries, but the nature of electricity remained mysterious. Machines known as electrical generators could produce dramatic sparks, and researchers experimented with charges, conductors, and insulating materials. Franklin became fascinated. He began conducting experiments and communicating with European scientists. One of the most important ideas he developed concerned the nature of electrical charge. Through experiments involving charged objects, Franklin proposed that electricity could be understood in terms of an excess or deficiency of a single electrical fluid. His terminology introduced concepts of positive and negative charge that remain part of scientific language today. His experiments also involved the famous Leyden jar, an early device capable of storing electrical charge. Franklin wanted to understand what electricity actually was. He designed experiments that were not merely demonstrations, but attempts to establish general principles. One of his most famous experiments involved a kite. For generations, the story has become almost legendary. According to the account, Franklin flew a kite during a thunderstorm, attaching a metal key to the kite string and using the setup to demonstrate that lightning was electrical in nature. The experiment, if performed as commonly described, would have been extraordinarily dangerous. Franklin himself understood the danger and proposed safer methods for investigating atmospheric electricity. Whether every detail of the popular kite story occurred exactly as later retellings suggest is less important than the scientific conclusion his experiments supported. Lightning was electrical. This was a profound realization. Lightning had often been associated with supernatural forces or mysterious atmospheric phenomena. Franklin demonstrated that the enormous electrical discharges seen during storms belonged to the same natural phenomenon scientists could reproduce on a much smaller scale in laboratories. From this understanding came another practical invention, the lightning rod. Franklin reasoned that a tall metal conductor could provide lightning with a safer path toward the ground, reducing the likelihood that buildings would be struck in destructive ways. The invention spread rapidly. It was a perfect example of Franklin's scientific philosophy. Understand nature, identify the principle, then use that understanding to solve a practical human problem. His work with electricity brought him international recognition. European scientific societies began corresponding with him. He received prestigious honors. He became one of the best-known scientific figures in the Atlantic world. Yet electricity was only one part of his intellectual life. Franklin investigated heat, meteorology, ocean currents, navigation, and other natural phenomena. He studied the Gulf Stream and helped produce one of the earliest maps of its course, recognizing its importance to ships traveling between Europe and North America. He also investigated the behavior of heat and proposed practical ideas about heating buildings and improving stoves. The Franklin stove became another example of his approach. Rather than merely accepting traditional designs, he analyzed how heat moved through rooms and developed a more efficient heating system. He could have patented the invention and attempted to profit from it. He chose not to. Franklin believed that useful inventions should benefit society. He famously refused to seek a patent for the Franklin stove, arguing that people should be free to improve and use useful inventions. This attitude would become a recurring theme throughout his life. Knowledge, in his view, gained value when it was shared. The more Franklin learned, the more he became convinced that science was not separate from everyday life. Understanding electricity could protect buildings. Understanding heat could improve homes. Understanding weather could help sailors. Understanding education could strengthen communities. Understanding human behavior could improve government. Everything was connected, and this philosophy would eventually carry Franklin far beyond the world of science and into the political transformation of an entire continent. As Benjamin Franklin's reputation grew, his life began to expand far beyond the printing business that had first established him in Philadelphia. He was becoming something unusual for his age, a person who moved comfortably between science, civic organization, literature, philosophy, and politics. His growing influence came largely from one habit that remained constant throughout his life. He kept asking practical questions. How can people become better educated? How can cities become safer? How can buildings be protected from fire and lightning? How can information be shared more efficiently? How can governments function more effectively? And perhaps most importantly, how can human beings use knowledge to improve the conditions in which they live? Franklin's approach to these questions was strongly influenced by the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment was not a single philosophy, but a broad intellectual movement that emphasized reason, observation, individual judgment, scientific inquiry, and the possibility of improving society through knowledge. Franklin embraced these principles naturally. He did not believe that tradition should automatically be treated as truth. If an old practice worked, it could be retained. If it did not work, it could be improved. If an accepted belief contradicted observation, it deserved to be questioned. This attitude helped shape his approach to religion as well. Franklin was deeply interested in moral philosophy, but he did not fit neatly into the religious categories of his time. He believed in God and in a moral order, yet he was skeptical of rigid religious dogmatism. He valued ethical behavior more than theological argument. For him, the important question was often not what a person claimed to believe, but how that belief affected their conduct. A person who spoke endlessly about virtue but behaved selfishly had achieved little. A person who quietly helped others had demonstrated something more meaningful. This practical approach to morality became one of the strongest themes in his writings. Franklin famously developed a personal system of 13 virtues, including temperance, silence, order, resolution, frugality, industry, sincerity, justice, moderation, cleanliness, tranquility, chastity, and humility. He attempted to organize his life around them. The project was almost scientific in its structure. He would focus on one virtue at a time, record his behavior, and try to identify where he had failed. The exercise reflected Franklin's belief that character could be deliberately improved. Just as an inventor could improve a machine through repeated adjustments, a person could improve their habits through conscious practice. This idea was central to his philosophy. Human beings were not trapped permanently by their weaknesses. They could learn, they could change, they could become more disciplined. But Franklin also recognized that perfection was extremely difficult. His famous autobiography presents this struggle with humor and honesty. He eventually admitted that while he had made considerable progress, he never completely mastered all 13 virtues. Even the attempt, however, had transformed his understanding of himself. Franklin's interest in self-improvement was closely connected with his belief in useful education. He became one of the leading figures behind the founding of the Academy and College of Philadelphia, which eventually developed into the University of Pennsylvania. The educational philosophy was innovative for its time. Franklin believed students should not be educated only in classical languages and abstract subjects. They should also learn science, mathematics, practical knowledge, communication, and skills useful to society. Education should prepare people not simply to repeat ancient knowledge, but to participate intelligently in the modern world. This was a radical idea in colonial America. Franklin was helping create an educational culture that valued experimentation and practical reasoning. His civic work continued to expand. He helped establish institutions devoted to learning, public safety, and community improvement. He supported hospitals and encouraged scientific societies. In 1743, he helped organize the American Philosophical Society, which became an important center for scientific and intellectual exchange in North America. The society reflected Franklin's belief that knowledge should not remain isolated. Scientists could communicate with one another. Observers could report unusual natural phenomena. Ideas could be tested and discussed. A community of inquiry could emerge. Franklin himself became a prolific correspondent. He exchanged letters with scientists, philosophers, political thinkers, and inventors across Europe and North America. In an era before modern scientific journals and instantaneous communication, correspondence was essential. A letter could carry an experimental result across the Atlantic. Franklin used this network effectively. His discoveries in electricity were communicated to European scientists, and his reputation grew rapidly. In 1753, he received the Copley Medal from the Royal Society in London, one of the most prestigious scientific honors of the era. He became an international scientific celebrity, but his scientific interests continued expanding. Franklin studied atmospheric electricity, electrical conductors, heat, refrigeration, meteorology, and the movement of ocean currents. His investigation of the Gulf Stream was particularly important. Ships traveling between Europe and North America had long noticed that some ocean routes were faster than others. Franklin became interested in understanding why. He consulted sailors and gathered observations about sea temperatures and currents. He realized that the Gulf Stream represented a powerful current carrying warm water northward through the Atlantic. He helped produce a map showing its path and encouraged ships to take advantage of the current. This was another example of Franklin's practical science. He did not study the ocean merely because it was intellectually interesting. He wanted knowledge that could help people navigate more efficiently. His work also extended to medicine. Franklin helped promote the establishment of Pennsylvania Hospital, recognizing the importance of organized medical care in a growing city. He also became interested in public health and investigated how cities could reduce dangers associated with disease and poor sanitation. Again, his thinking was practical. Observe the problem, identify the cause, develop a solution, organize people around it. This pattern appeared repeatedly throughout his life. Yet Franklin was not simply a benevolent civic reformer. He was also becoming increasingly involved in politics. The British colonies in North America were changing rapidly. Population was growing. Trade was expanding. Colonial governments were developing stronger institutions. At the same time, tensions between the colonies and the British government were beginning to increase. Franklin initially considered himself a loyal British subject. He did not begin his political life as a revolutionary. For many years, he believed that the British Empire could be reformed and that the colonies could remain connected to Britain while enjoying substantial self-government. His political views developed gradually as conflicts over taxation, representation, and imperial authority intensified. Franklin became an important representative of Pennsylvania in London. He spent years in Britain advocating for colonial interests. This period transformed his understanding of politics. He saw the British system from inside. He met politicians. He observed Parliament. He interacted with intellectuals. He became familiar with British society and its institutions. At first, he hoped compromise was possible, but the relationship between Britain and the colonies continued deteriorating. The issue of taxation became especially important. Colonists subjected to taxes imposed by Parliament when they had no elected representatives in that body. The famous argument emerged: no taxation without representation. Franklin increasingly supported the colonial position. His own political philosophy was developing around the idea that legitimate government depended upon the consent and participation of the people. Yet even then, he remained cautious. He did not immediately demand independence. He hoped the conflict could be resolved. Events would eventually convince him otherwise. The turning point came as Britain attempted to assert greater control over the colonies and resistance intensified. The Stamp Act, the Townshend Duties, the Boston Massacre, the Boston Tea Party, and the escalating confrontation between Britain and the colonies transformed political opinion. Franklin watched these developments closely. He understood that the conflict was no longer simply about individual taxes. It was becoming a fundamental argument over political authority. Who had the right to govern the colonies? Could Parliament impose laws upon people who had no representatives there? Could the colonies govern themselves? And if the British government refused meaningful reform, what options remained? Franklin's own position evolved with the crisis. Eventually, he would become one of the most important figures in the movement for American independence. But before that transformation was complete, he would experience one of the most painful political conflicts of his life. A confrontation that would involve his own son and force him to choose between family loyalty and political principle. Benjamin Franklin's political transformation was not sudden. For much of his earlier life, he considered himself a loyal member of the British Empire. He admired British institutions, maintained friendships in Britain, and believed that the colonies could prosper while remaining connected to the mother country. But political events gradually changed his mind. The conflict between Britain and the American colonies was becoming more than a disagreement over taxes. It was becoming a question about authority itself. Franklin increasingly believed that the colonies had developed societies capable of governing themselves. Their populations had grown, their economies had expanded, and their political institutions had matured. Yet decisions affecting colonial life were increasingly being made by a parliament in which the colonies had no elected representatives. For Franklin, this violated a basic principle. Government existed to serve the people. It should not exercise unlimited power over people who had no meaningful voice in its decisions. While Franklin was in Britain, he attempted to defend the interests of the American colonies through diplomacy and political persuasion. He wrote letters, met officials, spoke with members of parliament, and tried to find compromises. For a time, he believed reconciliation remained possible. But the relationship deteriorated. The British government became increasingly determined to assert its authority, while colonial resistance became increasingly organized. Franklin's own political position hardened. One of the most painful episodes involved his son, William Franklin. William was the royal governor of New Jersey and remained firmly loyal to Britain. Benjamin Franklin, meanwhile, was moving toward the revolutionary cause. This created an extraordinary family conflict. Father and son were now on opposite sides of one of the most consequential political struggles in the Atlantic world. Their disagreement was not merely theoretical. The American Revolution would eventually divide families, communities, and friendships across the colonies. Some people supported independence. Others remained loyal to Britain. Many found themselves trapped between the two. Franklin's relationship with William suffered severely. The political disagreement became a permanent personal wound, and the two would never fully reconcile. This revealed something important about Franklin. He was capable of great warmth and sociability, but when he became convinced that a principle was at stake, he could be remarkably firm. By the time the American Revolution began in earnest, Franklin had committed himself to the colonial cause. He returned to Philadelphia in 1775. The political world he entered was completely different from the one he had left. The colonies were moving rapidly toward independence. Franklin joined the Second Continental Congress and became one of its most influential members. There, he worked alongside figures such as George Washington, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, John Hancock, and other leaders of the Revolutionary movement. One of his most important roles was helping shape the Declaration of Independence. Thomas Jefferson wrote the initial draft, but Franklin was part of the small committee that reviewed and revised it. Franklin's contribution was not simply political. He understood the power of language. As a printer and writer, he knew that political documents had to communicate ideas clearly and memorably. The Declaration's central argument was revolutionary. Governments existed to secure fundamental rights. When a government repeatedly violated those rights and refused reform, the people could alter or abolish it. The colonies were no longer asking Britain for minor adjustments. They were declaring themselves independent states. On July 4, 1776, the Continental Congress formally adopted the Declaration of Independence. Franklin's role in this moment became part of American history. The famous painting of the Declaration Committee later helped create an image of the founders as a unified group of brilliant statesmen. Reality was more complicated. They disagreed constantly. They argued over strategy, economics, diplomacy, military decisions, and the future structure of government. Franklin's strength was often his ability to find common ground. His personality helped. He possessed an unusual combination of humor, intelligence, patience, and political instinct. He could communicate with wealthy politicians, ordinary citizens, scientists, diplomats, and foreign intellectuals. He understood that political success required more than having correct arguments. It required understanding people. As the Revolutionary War continued, the new American states faced a severe problem. They needed foreign assistance. Britain was one of the world's most powerful military and economic powers. The colonies had limited resources. France, Britain's longtime rival, represented the most promising potential ally. Franklin was sent to France as an American diplomat. This would become one of the most important diplomatic missions in American history. Franklin arrived in France in 1776. He quickly became an extraordinary public figure there. The French public was fascinated by him. His appearance became part of his image. He often wore simple clothing and a fur cap, presenting himself not as an elaborate European aristocrat, but as a practical American philosopher. The image was carefully compatible with the intellectual culture of the Enlightenment. Franklin represented a new kind of public figure. He was a scientist, a writer, a philosopher, a politician, a citizen rather than a hereditary aristocrat. French intellectuals admired him. Parisian society became fascinated by him. His reputation as the discoverer of electricity made him almost a celebrity. But behind the public image, Franklin was conducting extremely serious diplomacy. He needed French military and financial assistance. He understood that American independence might depend upon France entering the war against Britain. His diplomatic strategy required patience. He negotiated. He cultivated relationships. He appealed to French political interests. He emphasized Britain's global rivalry with France. And he presented the American cause as a legitimate struggle for liberty. In 1778, France formally recognized the United States and entered into an alliance with the Americans. This was a crucial turning point. French military assistance, money, weapons, naval power, and troops would become essential to the American war effort. Franklin played a central role in securing this support. His diplomatic success demonstrated another side of his intelligence. The same man who had studied lightning and ocean currents was now navigating the complicated currents of international politics. But Franklin's scientific reputation remained important. In France, his identity as a scientist strengthened his diplomatic influence. He was not simply another political representative. He was an internationally respected intellectual. This gave him a unique form of soft power. He embodied the idea that the new American Republic was not merely a rebellion against Britain. It was part of a broader intellectual movement toward reason, liberty, scientific inquiry, and political reform. Franklin spent years in France. His diplomatic work was exhausting. He managed negotiations, financial problems, military requests, political disputes, and relationships with French officials. At the same time, he continued writing and corresponding with scientists. Even in the middle of a war, his curiosity never disappeared. His health began deteriorating as he aged, and he suffered from painful medical conditions that limited his mobility. Yet he continued working. Eventually, the war began moving toward its conclusion. In 1781, American and French forces achieved a decisive victory over the British at Yorktown. The military situation changed dramatically. Peace negotiations followed. Franklin became one of the American negotiators responsible for ending the war. The Treaty of Paris was signed in 1783. Britain formally recognized the independence of the United States. After years of conflict, the American colonies had become an independent nation. Franklin had helped make that transformation possible, but independence was not the end of his work. The new country faced enormous challenges. It needed a functioning government. It needed financial stability. It needed diplomatic relationships. It needed to determine what kind of society it wanted to become. And perhaps most importantly, it had to confront a contradiction at the heart of its new political philosophy. The new nation spoke of liberty and equality while slavery remained deeply embedded in American society. Franklin had owned enslaved people earlier in his life, but over time his views changed significantly. By his later years, he became an active opponent of slavery. He supported abolitionist efforts and eventually became president of the Pennsylvania Society for Promoting the Abolition of Slavery. In 1790, shortly before his death, Franklin submitted a petition to Congress calling for an end to slavery and the slave trade. His earlier participation in the institution and his later opposition reflect a complicated moral evolution. Like many historical figures, Franklin's life contained contradictions. He was an advocate of liberty who had once participated in slavery. He promoted equality while living within a society filled with profound inequality. He believed in self-improvement, but admitted his own imperfections. He was a man of his time who sometimes managed to move beyond the assumptions of his time. And perhaps that complexity is part of what makes his life so historically important. Franklin's greatest legacy cannot be reduced to a single invention, political document, or scientific experiment. It lies in the extraordinary range of his intellectual life. But one final chapter remained. After helping create a new nation, Franklin returned to America. He was now elderly, physically weakened, and celebrated as one of the most important figures in the new republic. Yet even at this stage, he continued thinking about the future. The United States had achieved independence. Now it had to decide what kind of country it would become. When Benjamin Franklin returned permanently to Philadelphia after years of diplomacy in Europe, he was no longer the young printer who had arrived in the city carrying almost nothing. He was an elderly statesman, scientist, writer, inventor, publisher, diplomat, and one of the most recognizable figures of the newly independent United States. He had lived through an extraordinary transformation. He had seen 13 British colonies become an independent nation. He had helped build institutions that had barely existed when he was young. He had conducted experiments that changed humanity's understanding of electricity. He had communicated with scientists across the Atlantic. He had negotiated with foreign governments. He had helped shape the political language of a revolution. And now, in his final years, he faced one more enormous question. What kind of government should this new nation have? Independence had not solved America's problems. The Revolutionary War had left enormous debts. The individual states often disagreed with one another. The national government created under the Articles of Confederation was weak. There were disputes over trade, taxation, military funding, diplomacy, and the balance between state and national authority. The country had won independence, but it had not yet established a stable political system. Franklin was elected as a delegate to the Constitutional Convention in 1787. He was 81 years old. By then, his health had deteriorated considerably. He suffered from painful illnesses and often needed assistance to move. Yet he attended the convention and participated in its debates. The convention itself was filled with disagreements. The delegates argued over representation. They argued over federal power. They argued over taxation. They argued over the presidency. They argued over the relationship between the states and the national government. They argued about slavery. The atmosphere could become extremely tense. Franklin's role was often less about dominating the discussion and more about encouraging compromise. His age gave him unusual authority. He had spent decades observing political institutions in Britain, Europe, and America. He understood that no political system could function if every faction demanded that everything happen exactly according to its own preferences. Compromise was not necessarily weakness. Sometimes compromise was the mechanism that made cooperation possible. Near the end of the convention, the delegates faced the difficult question of whether they would actually approve the proposed constitution. Franklin offered a carefully worded statement supporting the document despite his awareness of its imperfections. He did not claim that the Constitution was flawless. Instead, he argued that he had doubts about certain aspects, but he was willing to support the whole because he believed the document offered the best opportunity for establishing a workable government. His approach reflected a central feature of his political philosophy. Human institutions were created by imperfect human beings. Expecting perfection was unrealistic. The important question was whether people could build systems capable of improvement. That idea connected Franklin's political thought with his scientific philosophy. In science, an experiment could reveal a mistake. A design could be modified. A machine could be improved. A hypothesis could be revised. Government, Franklin understood, could also require adjustment. The Constitution was not necessarily the final answer. It was an experiment in self-government. This idea became deeply embedded in the political culture of the United States. Franklin's public life was now coming to an end, but his intellectual interests remained alive. He continued writing letters. He continued thinking about science. He continued supporting civic causes, and he continued advocating for moral reform. One of the most important causes of his final years was the abolition of slavery. Franklin's position on slavery had changed significantly during his lifetime. He had once participated in the institution himself, but his experiences, his evolving moral reasoning, and his exposure to Enlightenment ideas eventually led him to oppose slavery. In 1787, the Pennsylvania Society for Promoting the Abolition of Slavery was reorganized, and Franklin became its president. He used his influence to support the abolitionist movement. Then, in 1790, he submitted a petition to the United States Congress requesting action against slavery and the slave trade. The petition created controversy. Congress ultimately did not abolish slavery. The institution would remain deeply embedded in American society for decades and would eventually contribute to a devastating civil war. Franklin would not live to see that conflict. But his final political actions demonstrated an important evolution in his thinking. He had spent his life believing that human beings could improve themselves and their institutions. In his final years, he applied that principle to one of America's greatest moral contradictions. A nation founded partly upon the language of liberty could not easily justify the continued enslavement of human beings. Franklin's own history was complicated. He had not always recognized the contradiction, but he changed his position. That change itself was significant. He demonstrated that intellectual growth does not necessarily mean having the correct answer from the beginning. Sometimes it means being willing to revise one's beliefs when experience and reflection reveal their weaknesses. This willingness to change was one of the strongest characteristics of Franklin's life. He was never satisfied with simply inheriting ideas. He tested them, he questioned them, he modified them, he replaced them when necessary. His scientific work reflected this. His political life reflected it. His moral development reflected it. Even his personal philosophy was built around continuous improvement. Franklin's famous 13 virtues were not simply a list of moral ideals. They represented an experiment in character. He attempted to measure himself against standards such as temperance, industry, sincerity, justice, moderation, and humility. He failed at times. He admitted it, but he continued trying. That may be one of the most enduring aspects of his philosophy. Perfection was not required for progress. Improvement was enough. The same principle could be applied to a person, a community, a scientific theory, or a government. No human creation was perfect, but each could potentially become better. Franklin's final years were increasingly dominated by illness. His health had been fragile for a long time, and years of travel, political work, and physical suffering had taken their toll. He spent much of his time at his home in Philadelphia. Visitors came to see him. Letters continued arriving from around the world. His reputation had become enormous. European intellectuals regarded him as one of the great representatives of the Enlightenment. Americans regarded him as one of the founders of their new nation. Scientists remembered him for his experiments. Printers remembered him as a master of publishing. Civic leaders remembered his work establishing institutions. Diplomats remembered his role in securing French support during the Revolution. But Franklin's identity was never confined to one profession. That may be his most distinctive quality. He did not live inside a single intellectual category. He moved between disciplines. He believed knowledge belonged to everyone. Science should improve life. Education should strengthen society. Writing should communicate ideas. Government should serve the public. Invention should solve problems. And personal morality should be practiced rather than merely discussed. On April 17, 1790, Benjamin Franklin died in Philadelphia. He was 84 years old. Thousands of people attended his funeral. The man who had once arrived in Philadelphia as a poor teenager had become one of the most influential figures of the 18th century. His death marked the end of an extraordinary life. But his ideas continued traveling. His scientific terminology survived. His electrical experiments became part of the history of physics. His lightning rod became a practical symbol of applied science. His work on the Gulf Stream contributed to the developing science of oceanography. His civic institutions continued operating. His writings continued to be read. His political contributions became part of the foundation of American history. And his philosophy of practical knowledge continued influencing generations of inventors, entrepreneurs, scientists, educators, and public servants. Perhaps the most important lesson of Franklin's life is that intelligence does not have to remain theoretical. Knowledge becomes powerful when it is used. Franklin did not study electricity simply to satisfy curiosity. He wanted to understand lightning and protect buildings. He did not study ocean currents merely because they were fascinating. He wanted sailors to navigate more efficiently. He did not promote libraries simply because books were beautiful. He wanted ordinary people to have access to knowledge. He did not support education merely as a symbol of civilization. He wanted citizens capable of thinking independently. He did not participate in politics merely to gain power. He believed political institutions could improve human society. His life, therefore, represents a particular vision of the Enlightenment, the belief that human beings can investigate the world, that they can question inherited assumptions, that they can use reason and evidence, that they can organize themselves collectively, that they can invent solutions, that they can educate themselves, and that societies, despite their imperfections, can become better through deliberate effort. Franklin also demonstrated something more subtle. Progress does not come from one kind of intelligence. Scientific intelligence matters, but so does social intelligence. So does political judgment. So does practical wisdom. So does the ability to communicate. Franklin possessed an unusual combination of all of them. He could conduct an electrical experiment in one period of his life and negotiate an international treaty in another. He could write a humorous newspaper essay and then participate in debates about the structure of government. He could design a stove, organize a fire company, establish a library, study an ocean current, and help shape a revolution. This range was extraordinary, but it was not accidental. Behind everything was curiosity. Franklin wanted to know, and once he knew, he wanted to ask what could be done with that knowledge. That question may be the simplest way to understand his entire life. What can we do with what we have learned? What problem can this knowledge solve? How can an idea become useful? How can an individual become better? How can a community become stronger? How can a government become more just? These questions connected the different parts of his life. They explain why the printer became a scientist, why the scientist became an inventor, why the inventor became a civic organizer, why the civic organizer became a politician, why the politician became a diplomat, and why, even after becoming one of the most famous people of his generation, he continued to think of himself primarily as someone capable of learning. Benjamin Franklin left behind no single theory comparable to Newton's laws or Darwin's theory of evolution. His legacy was broader. He demonstrated a way of living intellectually. Be curious, observe carefully, question assumptions, experiment, learn from failure, share useful knowledge, improve what already exists, help other people learn, and never assume that education has an endpoint. His life also reminds us that great historical figures are rarely simple. Franklin had contradictions. He was a champion of liberty who had once participated in slavery. He promoted virtue while admitting his own imperfections. He valued humility while becoming internationally famous. He supported political compromise while eventually participating in a revolution. He was deeply practical, yet endlessly curious about abstract questions. These contradictions do not erase his achievements. They make his life more human. Franklin was not a perfect man. He was a man who continually experimented with becoming better. And perhaps that is why his story remains so powerful. The young boy who received little formal education became a scientist recognized across Europe. The poor teenager who arrived in Philadelphia became one of the founders of a nation. The printer who wrote newspaper essays became a diplomat. The amateur investigator of electricity became a pioneer of American science. The civic organizer who worried about fires and libraries helped build institutions that outlived him. And the man who spent his life asking questions left behind a legacy that continues to encourage people to ask their own. Benjamin Franklin's greatest invention may therefore not have been a physical device at all. It was a model of the curious citizen, a person who does not wait for someone else to solve every problem, a person who learns, experiments, builds, questions, cooperates, adapts, and tries to leave the world slightly better than it was found. His life began in a crowded Boston household with limited formal education. It ended in Philadelphia, surrounded by a nation that had not existed when he was born. Between those two moments was a lifetime of learning, experimentation, failure, invention, diplomacy, conflict, compromise, and extraordinary change. The world Franklin entered was ruled largely by inherited authority. The world he helped create placed greater faith in reason, experimentation, education, and self-government. And that transformation was perhaps his deepest legacy. He showed that knowledge does not belong only to institutions. It belongs to anyone willing to pursue it. He showed that a person does not need to begin with wealth, privilege, or formal education to become an important contributor to human knowledge. And he showed that curiosity, when combined with discipline and a willingness to serve others, can become a force far greater than personal ambition. Benjamin Franklin spent his life trying to understand electricity, weather, oceans, politics, morality, society, and human nature. But beneath all of those questions was one enduring belief that human beings are capable of learning. And if they continue learning, questioning, experimenting, and improving, they are capable of changing not only themselves, but the world around them.